So guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how you can obtain a first element within a list that meets a certain criteria. So in this case, I created a user class which has the attributes ID, name, location, a constructor which then supplies those values to those attributes, and then I created a list of users who I then called students, who is a list of objects over here. And we have James, Rhodes, Mike, Anne, and the location Nairobi, London, and just unique IDs to identify them. So in this case, I created a user object, user student, and in this case, I want to obtain students, the first student who meets a certain criteria. In this case, I want to use something more unique. So for example, I have location Nairobi. So I want to obtain this the first student who will meet this particular criteria, or the first student who belongs in London, or the first student who belongs in Nairobi. So in this case, I can use a first where clause, and I'll explain it in just a few. So I use this first where clause. So what happens with the first where clause is it iterates. So let me just first of all run so that you see what I mean, so that we see the result, and then from the result explain. So as in this case, it will show as Mike, and Mike is in the location of London, and that's what we wanted. The first criteria that meets that, we wanted that object that meets that, and then we print it. So what happens in this case? So let me explain. So whenever you use you use a first where clause, what happens is this function iterates through each object, looking for the criteria that you have set. So if that criteria is met, if that criteria is true, then it returns that particular object. So in this case, what happens is when I call the first where, it loops through each particular object. So in this case, then I pass each object as it loops through. So this is just a representation of the user class. So it loops through each object. So for example, let's say right now it's in the first object. So in that first object is the student location equivalent to London. If it's true, then that item will be returned and assigned to student. So this is just an expression, but to explain it easier, this is the same as writing this is criteria met, and I pass it here. So I created a function called isCriteriaMet, which passes in a user student. So a user, the class user, and in this case I call that object student, and then I check is the student location in London, which is the same as the criteria we wrote here, but this one looks much simpler and it's easier to explain. So is criteria met. So you can, it's all about preference. You can either write a function or you can write an expression. I usually prefer an expression because it's easier, but if it's your first time, I will advise you to use functions. As you get used to it, then automatically the expressions become easier. So is criteria met. So what happens is as it iterates through each object, it then passes that particular object. So it iterates through this list, and as it iterates, it takes the first object and then evaluates whether this particular object meets that condition. So in the first where, as it evaluates each particular object, then for each particular object, I call this particular function is criteria met. So as it evaluates each particular object, I call this function student, which takes in student, which is just an object of the user class, and then that particular function I evaluate my criteria, and in this case my criteria is that particular student location in London. So it will begin with the James and check is that location in London, no, then return a false. Is that location in London? No, return a false. Is that location in London? True, the location is in London, therefore this criteria is met, and if the boolean is true, then it returns that object, and that object is assigned to student, and that student is what I print, and that's why we have this. And this, whatever is printed here, is whatever met our criteria, and our criteria was simply student location is in London. So, and you can change this to whatever criteria you want. Nairobi and it will still return, in this case, it will return this as the result, and that's what we expect. ID, let's say ID location here, and that's right. James, it will return James as the first object in that particular list. So, in some cases, when you call this particular function, in some cases, this location might not be true. So I might be searching, let's say for New York. Let's say I'm searching for New York, and this will throw an error because this particular object expects that this criteria will be met. But if this criteria is not met, it will return a null, and this one does not this particular object or this particular variable does not expect it to be a null value. So if I was to run and I'm looking for a criteria that's not yet there or does not satisfy, you'll see uncaught error but state no element. Even if you were to do this and say it will be nullable and still run it again, we'll still run into an error. So how can we handle this so that we avoid these errors? And an easy way of doing this is there's something called an or else. So whenever you use the first where, you can include something called an or else. So what happens is if that particular criteria is not met, so I might be searching for New York, and within this particular list there's no location that's set to New York. So what can I do? How can I handle it? So instead of getting an error, you can actually handle this by doing an or else. So an or else, which returns also another function. In this case, depending on whatever criteria you want to use, in some cases people return null, but if you return null, it will then throw an error because the return null isn't a user as required by the closure. So it expects that the user, what will be returned in this case will be a user object. You can return a user object, you can create a user object whose ID probably will be -1, and with a name which is probably whatever name you want to add, and then a location. This is just one way of doing it, but it might also cause errors, and probably you can check if ID is -1. You can write another statement. If ID is -1, then the result wasn't found. So this means, to take care of this scenario, it means you will never have a scenario where you'll have the ID as negative or the ID as a 0. That's just one criteria of handling it. So, and you can return whatever you want. If you're using a list of strings, then you can return probably no result found. So this is just a way of handling it. But remember, whatever you return here is whatever is expected on this other side. So in this case, I cannot return a string. But if I wanted to return a null, and I really want to return a null, then I can do this. This is just a better way of how you can handle it. So I'll use something called a cast. So what a cast does, it creates a view of that particular list. So it returns a view of the list this list as a list of R instances. That is my cat saying hi. So it will return a view of this particular list, which is a student list, and then it can say in this list, expect that the user object can be null. So what I've done is I've taken the student list, this one, and I've cast it to a new list, like declaring it to a new list or a view of that list, and I can do whatever operations I want with that particular list now as a new list or as a view for that list. So, and then I can say cast user object, which I expect, in this case, I'll declare it as being expected to be null. So is criteria met in this particular? So I can't pass. So because I've said that I expect this one to be null, if I leave it like this, it will work. But here, I'll still get an error. But then I can say I'm casting it to this particular view, I'm casting this list to a new view, and that view might be nullable. And if it might be nullable, then this is also expected to be nullable. And if that's expected to be nullable, if the user object is expected to be nullable, my criteria might be nullable. So this is just a way of handling it. And in this case, I can return now that user as null, and this will accept. So it's just many ways of just handling this scenario of a null. Let's say, yeah, and there we go, we print a null. So, and you can write if student is null, its result not found. Else print student. Yeah, I forgot the semicolon. Yeah, and then it tells result not found. So this is just a method of handling in the case whereby you're not sure that you might pass in a parameter or something that the user is searching for that might not be within that particular list. Then this can be an easier way of actually handling that particular criteria, or better still, you might handle it, you don't necessarily need the cast method, you can just handle it directly, students.firstware, and return whatever user object that you expect and use that user object to evaluate, and it will still work. But in this case, obviously, if you return a user object and I pass in the ID as -1 and the location, let's see, as whatever location, and the name as whatever name, it will still work, and you can use this, the student.id is equivalent -1. But this is only if and you're sure that you'll never have a scenario whereby the IDs you'll ever have a -1. You can still use that as a way of actually handling that. But this is just the or else is meant to return if this criteria is not met in any circumstance and all the criteria return it as false. How can you handle a scenario whereby it's false so that you don't end up with an error within your code? And that's simply it for this tutorial.